So speaking to this collection of photographs this evening is art historian and curator Bonnie Yochelson. She has authored 2 books on Berenice Abbott, including the go-to compendium of Abbott's photographs in Berenice Abbott, Changing New York, the Complete WPA Project. She's written numerous books and articles on New York architecture and is the former curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York. Currently, she is completing, I believe, maybe it is completed, a catalog of Jacob Riis's photos. But not quite. Is it ever quite done till it goes to the printer? Which will accompany an exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York in 2014. Please join me in welcoming to Wichita and the Ulrich Museum, Bonnie Yochelson.
Well, as Amy said, in 1997, which she didn't say, but which is the case, I published the book, the cover which is on the screen, Changing New York, a book on Berenice Abbott's epic photographic portrait of Depression-era New York City. The book contains an essay that tells the story behind the project and includes entries on each of the 305 photographs in it, and at that time I also organized a traveling exhibition for the Museum of the City of New York, which owns Abbott's archive, and which holds the definitive archive of that collection. And with the exhibition here of Changing New York prints in the galleries here, I want to share with you Abbott's story and also place it in a larger, broader historical context. Let me begin with a discussion of Eugene Atget, who's in the exhibition. You'll see there are photographs of his, and they're actually printed by Abbott, a Parisian photographer who inspired her, followed by a more detailed discussion of her project, in which I'll point out some of the similarities and differences between them and their work. And then at the end, I'd like to alert you to the controversy over Atget's significance in the history of photography. Abbott believed that Atget was a great artist, perhaps the greatest artist in the history of photography, and her view was eloquently argued by John Zerkowski, the Museum of Modern Art's legendary curator who acquired Atget's archive for the museum in 1968. And in the 1980s, Zerkowski's view, which had by then become conventional wisdom, was rancorously challenged by critics who claimed that Atget was not an artist at all. Rather, he was a 19th century commercial photographer who had been molded into an artist by Abbott to serve her own creative purposes, and more ominously by scholars and museum curators, Zerkowski prominently among them, who had vested interest in this view. The controversy is unresolvable. We will never know what Atget himself intended, but I hope that being aware of it will enrich your viewing of the current exhibition, and perhaps that you'll come to form an opinion of your own. Although very little is known of Atget's life, research on him has been prodigious, and the basic outlines of his career are clear. Eugene Atget was born in 1857, orphaned as a child, and brought up by his grandparents in southern France. During his 20s, he fulfilled a 5-year military requirement while struggling to become an actor, a pursuit that landed him in Paris for several years, but that ultimately failed. In 1888, at the age of 31, Atget took up photography, and in 1892, he started a business producing what he called documents for artists. During his acting days, Atget had lived among artists, and so he began his photography business catering to their needs. By that time, in the 1890s, most artists, from the academically trained to the most avant-garde, relied on photographs of landscapes, plants, and animals to use as substitutes for drawn sketches. In 1897, however, Atget developed a new specialty, photographing the streets, buildings, and decorations of vieux Paris, or Old Paris. The radical reshaping of Paris in the 1850s and 1860s during the Second Empire of Napoleon III required the wholesale demolition of many of the city's oldest neighborhoods and fueled a romantic nostalgia for the pre-industrial era. This nostalgia created a market for views of everything medieval and ancien regime, and it was collectors of these views who became Atget's primary clients. They included craftsmen who copied older styles in stonework, ironwork, and furniture, amateur antiquarians, and government archives, such as the Bibliothèque Nationale and the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris. So just to show you a couple examples of these city views that were typical of Atget's output. This is just an old courtyard that was made in 1912. And then this is a staircase in an hotel that was an old, a house, an hotel in Branches, a sort of mansion for a wealthy family from 1904. And I just point out to you, typical of Atget, he photographed the staircase. That was the point, for its ironwork. But he composed it in such a way as to include a Victorian, essentially a modern light fixture. It had been put in as a gas fixture, and by the time he took the picture, was electric. So that kind of juxtaposition is very typical of Atget's work. Becoming a staff photographer for one of those those government agencies would have given Atget a steadier and larger income, but he preferred to remain independent, retaining ownership of his negatives and asserting greater freedom in his choice of subjects. Atget's commercial practice thrived between 1898 and 1914, when World War I disrupted life for all Parisians, photographers included. Photographers faced particular difficulties, namely the scarcity of photographic supplies and the prohibition against photographing for security reasons. When the war ended in 1918, Atget was 60 years old. Doubting his ability to renew his business and fearful for the safety of his archive, he sold 2,600 of his negatives of old Paris to the National Historic Registry, Les Monuments Historiques. The sale safeguarded the heart of his life's work and provided him with 10,000 francs, a nest egg for his old age. In his remaining years, Atget continued to photograph Paris and its suburbs, expanding his range of subject matter to include aspects of modern life and returning to sites to consider them anew. This is an example of one of the modern life pictures. Clearly, it's another old back alley, but it includes a car and a motorcycle. And this one is from 1922. And this is a storefront from the Avenue des Gobelins from 1927, it's actually the last year of his life, which includes those modern mannequins and the most up-to-date fashions. Then it's an example of the kind of returning to a site that he had photographed earlier that would have already been in his inventory. This is a suburban chateau, Saint-Cloud, from 1904. This would have required him getting on the train with his camera. I should mention that the camera he used is a large view camera. It's the actual the ground glass where he could see the picture was 8 by 10 inches. So that the box that it's in is yay big. And so it's heavy, and a tripod and a focusing cloth, and it's quite a bit of, and then the actual plates that he took the pictures on were glass. So it really meant, carrying around about 40 or 50 pounds of equipment. And this is for an elderly man who's not doing this as business, but for out of love. So you can imagine this old guy in his 60s, packing up his things, going out, taking that first train out so that he could be at dawn at Saint-Cloud to take a picture like this. So this is a return to Saint-Cloud in 1922. Living modestly in Montmartre with Valentine Compagnon, his partner of over 30 years, Atget photographed with increased freedom and with less concern for sales. Valentine, who was 10 years his senior, died in 1926. A little more than a year later, Atget, at age 70, followed her to the grave. Sometime in the mid-1920s, the American Man Ray, who was from Philadelphia and who had changed his name and moved to New York and then Paris, came upon Atget's studio and purchased some photographs. Ray was a surrealist painter and sculptor who earned his living as a fashion and celebrity photographer and whose studio was a few blocks from Atget's. This is just a sort of typical example of Man Ray's work from that time. This is a famous celebrity among the sort of bohemian crowd in Paris. Her name was Kiki of Montparnasse, and the name of this is the Violin of Ang. So it's a kind of, he's taken a picture of Kiki posing like an Ang odalisque, and he's just drawn on it what are those called, the openings on the violin? Thank you. To turn her body into a violin. It's a little bit like Marcel Duchamp's putting a mustache on the Mona Lisa, which was about the same time as well. It's a surrealist type of joke about femininity and sort of sexuality of women. In 1926, Ray published 4 of Atget's photographs in the avant-garde journal La Révolution Surréaliste, and he encouraged his fellow artists to visit the elderly photographer and purchase a few prints at a modest cost. Ray took a somewhat patronizing attitude toward Le Père Atget. He considered him a primitive, unschooled artist and viewed his photographs as found objects. He and the Surrealists brought their own interests in the subconscious to Atget's photographs, seeing in the deserted streets, storefronts, and service vehicles a feeling for the mystery lurking just beneath the surface of ordinary experience. And I should mention one of the Atget pictures in the exhibition is a picture that did appear in La Révolution Surréaliste. It shows a crowd of people on the street looking up, wearing special glasses to shade their eyes at a eclipse. And so it's just a very odd urban moment where, Ray saw that as, being a perfect surrealist picture, but again, sort of as a found object, not reading into it the kind of strangeness that the surrealists love, which may or may not have been Atget's interest. Atget, for his part, did not take the young rebels very seriously. He refused to allow Ray to publish his name in the magazine, and he rebuffed Ray's efforts to introduce him to small, modern cameras, which he said were too fast, meaning that with a large camera, you have a long, slow exposure, and you can't capture movement for that reason. The small handheld cameras, which were new in the 20s, like a 35 millimeter camera, could capture stop motion, which is exactly what the Surrealists liked. For example, those of you who know some of this work, Henri Cartier-Bresson, The Decisive Moment, he was one of the great pioneers of the 35 millimeter camera. Atget said, no, that doesn't interest me, it's too fast. Oh, I guess this is another example of the kind of image of Atget's, that the Surrealists would have liked. One of Man Ray's friends who regarded Atget's photographs with something more than a surrealist shiver was Berenice Abbott. She, like Ray, emigrated from New York to Paris, following the pulse of the avant-garde in the wake of the war. Born in Springfield, Ohio in 1898, Abbott dropped out of Ohio State University after one semester and at the age of 19 moved to New York. She followed an already established pattern of artistic hopefuls from the American heartland flocking to Greenwich Village in search of culture and adventure. With no money or family to help her, Abbott took an assortment of odd jobs, waitressing and working as an artist model, to cover the rent in her shared apartment. It was at this time that she met Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp, whom she later boasted she had taught to dance. This is a picture of her by Man Ray, and this is a painting by a Czech artist named Josef Sima from 1928, in which she is the model. As the Roaring Twenties got underway, however, Greenwich Village began to feel too commercialized for its young bohemians, and they emigrated en masse to Paris. Studying sculpture and modern dance in Paris and Berlin, Abbott later claimed that the cafes of Paris had formed her education and her identity. It was in Paris that she added a second E to her name, transforming it from the Midwestern Bernice to the French Berenice. In 1923, broke and down on her luck, Abbott took her first steady job as a darkroom assistant to Man Ray. She worked for him for 2.5 years before she began to make her own portraits, but soon her reputation rivaled her employers. And just show you some examples, this is her 1926 picture of James Joyce, which is really now the most famous portrait of Joyce. And this is her photograph of Janet Flaner, who in 1927 in Paris, Janet Flaner was one of the earliest New Yorker writers. She wrote the Paris Journal for the New Yorker, I think for actually 50 years, starting in the mid-20s when the magazine started. In 1923, I wrote that, sorry. It was at this time that Abbott met Atget, whose work had an immediate and profound effect on her. Recalling the first time she saw his photographs, she wrote, "Their impact was immediate and tremendous. There was a sudden flash of recognition, the shock of realism unadorned. The subjects were not sensational, but nevertheless shocking in their very familiarity. The real world, seen with wonderment and surprise, was mirrored in each print. Whatever means Atget used to project the image did not intrude between subject and observer." Abbott was a part of the Surrealist circle, but her artistic temperament was akin to Atget's, unaffected and plain-spoken. In Atget, Abbott began to recognize her artistic self. In 1927, Abbott asked Atget to pose for a portrait, and there is a variation of this from the same sitting that is in the gallery, I think which belongs to the Ulrich, which is not borrowed. I happen to have it in the collection. When she brought prints, proof prints from this session, photo session, to his studio, she was stunned to learn that Atget had died. Fearing that his work would be lost, Abbott met with André Calmet, Atget's executor, who was an old friend from his acting days. Calmet arranged for a second group of old Paris negatives to go to the National Historic Registry, and he sold the remaining contents of Atget's studio, 1,400 glass plates and 5,800 paper prints, to Abbott for $1,000. Abbott was crazy to do this. At age 29, she had spent 10 years living hand-to-mouth and had just begun to establish her career. She owned no property and had no savings. The $1,000 came from Julian Levy, a recent Harvard graduate and would-be filmmaker, who was thinking about opening an art gallery when he returned to New York. Abbott was not at all the only artist interested in Atget at the time, but with the purchase of his estate, she took responsibility for his legacy. For the rest of her life, she promoted two careers, her own and Atget's. Her first initiative was a book of Atget's photographs published in Paris in 1930. With the French book arranged, Abbott visited the United States in January 1929, in part to visit her mother in Ohio, and in part to find an American publisher for her Atget book. She was amazed with what she saw. In her 8 years abroad, New York experienced a massive building boom. Whole blocks of 19th century buildings were torn down for office and apartment buildings, and the early skyscrapers of the pre-war era were dwarfed by sleek Art Deco towers that rose 1,000 feet in the air. Using a small held-hand camera, it was actually a camera given to her by Peggy Guggenheim, Abbott exposed about 200 negatives and compiled contact sheets of these negatives in a scrapbook, which now belongs to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She later referred to these images as notes for future work, and many of the themes she later developed, public sculpture, commercial signs, skyscraper construction, appear in these sample scrapbook pages. This page shows mostly views from above, looking down on the street, which is a sort of specialty of a small handheld camera. You can see in the middle, on the far right, she's interested in signage and a sort of collage type of use of words, the way you might find in a Picasso work, things like that. This is another page. These are actually street scenes taken from the street, largely under the L, so she's interested in the kind of strange geometries and shadows and confusion of shadow and solid form, again, and sort of informed by Cubist ideas that she was finding walking around the city. These pages are more than quick studies, however. They show the influence of European aesthetics. Abbott's use of extreme vantage point and stop action shows that she had absorbed the modernist possibilities of the handheld camera that were pioneered in the 1920s by European photographers among her friends, like André Kertész and Germaine Krull. Especially apparent in the 20 images Abbott chose to enlarge for various exhibitions and publications from this group of 200 negatives is her adoption not only of European style, but of a European approach to New York as a generic modern city. In this picture called Lincoln Square, for example, Abbott eliminated the particularities of time and place to capture the disorienting sensation of city life that the French surrealists had described. Taken from the platform of the 9th Avenue L at Broadway and 65th Street, at basically what's now Lincoln Center, the photograph skillfully suggests that persons and objects are interchangeable and that the movement is constant without apparent purpose. By the time she completed her U.S. trip, Abbott resolved to change the course of her life. Recognizing that she was witnessing a critical moment in the history of the city, indeed the history of the century, she determined to give up Paris to return to New York and document the changing face of the city. She packed up her things, including the Atget archive, and moved back to New York in the fall of 1929, just before the stock market crash in October. This move was no doubt inspired by the example of Atget. When she purchased the archive, Abbott had asked Calmet to write a reminiscence of his friend. In his letter to Abbott, Calmet explained that Atget had shunned commissions because, quote, people did not know what to photograph, unquote. Instead, Atget chose an immense subject, creating a collection of all that which both in Paris and its surroundings was artistic and picturesque. When Abbott saw New York in 1929, she surely encountered her own immense subject. Upon her return, Abbott mentioned to several journalists that her aim was to do in Manhattan what Atget did in Paris. That she was modeling herself on Atget is most evident in her purchase in 1930 of an 8x10 camera similar to Atget's. The change of camera necessitated a radically changed approach to her subject, as seen in the 1930 photograph of Cherry Street on the Lower East Side. Giving up the flexibility and speed of the small handheld camera, Abbott showed the plain facades of a group of the city's oldest buildings. Architecture is the principal subject, and instead of concentrating on subjects that symbolize the speed and brashness of American life, Abbott chose subjects that were disappearing in the wake of accelerated change. More static than the 1929 images, these 8x10-inch contact prints are also more detailed. With photographs such as this, Abbott shifted her attention from the general subject of the modern city to the specific time and place of New York in the 1930s. Abbott, like Atget, was more than an antiquarian, however. Atget often chose to combine elements from different eras within a single photograph, and I already gave you the example of the staircase, the old staircase with the electric light. This is another example. And in this one, the layering of history is, again, this is the interior of one of those grand houses in Paris, and he's chosen specifically to photograph a fireplace that had a mirror inserted in it. And so it's this, which of course also includes him, his camera. He's there under the focusing cloth photographing. But you can imagine the many ways that he could have photographed this building. I mean, this room without focusing specifically on the modern mirror in the fireplace. Abbott did this too, based at least in part on her understanding of Atget. The title of her project, Changing New York, stresses her desire to represent the city and the process of change itself. In Peck Slip, also of 1930, Abbott juxtaposed commercial buildings dating from before the Civil War with the Brooklyn Bridge, which more than any other technological feat of the Victorian era transformed New York into a modern metropolis. Although inspired by Atget, Abbott was a very different person faced with a very different set of challenges. Unlike her mentor, Abbott was technically oriented and used the best, most up-to-date equipment she could afford. And although she felt a temperamental kinship to Atget, she was a member of an elite corps of avant-garde artists conversant in every ism, Cubism, Surrealism, etc., and she was well known within the art world. Perhaps most important, New York was not Paris. Abbott's subject, a tiny island of narrow streets and soaring skyscrapers, required her to push her equipment and her sense of composition in entirely new directions. Compositional control was the large view camera's greatest asset. With her head beneath a focusing cloth, Abbott saw an exact image, full size, albeit upside down. By adjusting the camera's swings and tilts, she could control perspective, focus, and framing with great precision. During the 10 years that Abbott photographed New York with the View camera, she became a virtuoso as a comparison of two views of West Street shows. This first one is called West Street Row number 3. A group of commercial buildings near the Hudson River waterfront appears much as it did, except for the automobiles, as it did in the 19th century. In Vista West Street, where she returned to this same place, Abbott photographed the same row of buildings, but by varying her camera position and using a long lens, she revealed Wall Street skyscrapers looming over the modest structures of an earlier era. The long lens, which produced a telephoto effect, was the key to many of Abbott's contrast photographs, as one more example demonstrates. In Union Square, Abbott juxtaposed the 1876 statue of the French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, in Union Square Park, with the new S. Klein department store across the street. In a variant negative made with a short lens, the statue was lost in the middle distance, but with the long lens, you can see that the sculpture's in the middle. This is the contrast. With the long lens, the space is foreshortened, and the statue amusingly seems to gesture toward the discount store, as if yielding 19th century civic ideals to 20th century commercial ones. A kind of surrealist joke, actually. Gaining control of her camera, Abbott exercised greater compositional freedom. In the late 1930s, she returned to sites she had photographed earlier, rethinking them in a new way. Abbott's first view of the Flatiron Building, that's this one, which was taken before 1934, was taken from the 5th floor of a building on 25th Street. It shows the Flatiron's famous silhouette at the intersection of Broadway, 5th Avenue, and 23rd Street. As a comparison with the 1909 postcard suggests, this approach was conventional. Here's the postcard. Photographers traditionally sought high vantage points to show a building full size in its urban context. When Abbott returned to the site in 1938, however, she stood right in the middle of traffic and pointed her camera skyward, transforming the famous structure into an arrow in space. This pattern of replacing a rational overview with a distorted, fragmented close-up, which maps the transition from Renaissance-based to Cubist-based pictorial construction, occurs time and again. Once you see the modernist ideas in Abbott's photographs, it's hard not to see them. And here's just another example of a kind of surrealist treatment of a gun shop. Abbott is standing underneath that sign and pointing up at it. The building that that gun is pointing at is police headquarters. Here's another one. This is in what we would now call Soho, a district full of cast iron fronted warehouses. In Abbott's day, it was called just part of the Lower East Side. She has created a sort of cubist composition by standing on a fire escape on one side of the street, looking through the fire escape to the cast iron facade on the other side, which is kind of creating this layering, and then of course also featuring the commercial lettering, all of which are kind of ideas inspired by Cubist composition. This brief summary gives you, I hope, some idea of what Abbott was doing with the camera on the street. Like most artists, however, she spent more time trying to support and promote her work than actually making it. Here, the divergence between Abbott's and Atget's stories widens. Atget worked for artists, but was not one of them. Among his primary clients were government agencies, which within France was not and is not controversial. Abbott's ambitions unfolded within a world of art galleries, museum exhibitions, and commercial publishers. At its heart was the most contested episode of government patronage of the arts in U.S. history. And Abbott, unlike Atget, had her eye on posterity and left scrapbooks full of feature stories, interviews, and reviews of her work. It is therefore considerably easier to retrace her steps than to retrace Atget's. When Abbott returned to New York in 1929, she was naive enough to think that she could replicate her success in Paris, and she leased a studio in the fashionable Hôtel des Artistes. It didn't take long to learn that Americans were less willing than Europeans to pay $50 for a photographic portrait, and all remnants of hope were dashed by the October 29 stock market crash that initiated the Depression. Abbott moved 3 times, each time to less expensive quarters. The last move in 1935 was to a cheap loft at 50 Commerce Street in Greenwich Village, where she remained for 30 years. Abbott made some portraits, worked briefly for Fortune magazine, and took whatever commercial assignment she could get, saving Wednesdays to photograph the streets of New York. In 1932 and again in 1934, she applied and was rejected by the Guggenheim Foundation, which in 1925 had begun awarding yearly stipends to artists. Despite financial difficulties, Abbott was highly respected within the small world of photography. Her Paris portraits and her New York photographs were extensively exhibited and published in the early 30s. In 1930, she was included in an exhibition at the Harvard Society for Contemporary Art, organized by Lincoln Kirstein and modeled on the landmark Film and Photo Show in Stuttgart in 1929. In 1932, she appeared in a group show in a new 57th Street gallery opened by Julian Levy, a classmate of Kirstein's, and you'll remember Abbott's partner in the purchase of Atget's archive. The same year, she participated in murals by American painters and photographers organized at the fledgling Museum of Modern Art by Kirstein and Levy. Abbott submitted a photomontage measuring 4 by 6 feet with fragments of New York scenes inserted between giant girders. This is the page devoted to Abbott's photo mural in that catalog I just showed you, and you can see on the very lower edge, sort of toward the center, one of the pictures she inserted was that Lincoln Square with the horse statue and the figure walking. 1934 was such a busy year that I doubt Abbott had much time for new photography. She was asked to initiate the photography program at the New School for Social Research, a position she held for 23 years. That summer, she was commissioned by architectural historian Henry Russell Hitchcock, a Harvard friend of Kirstein and Levy, to photograph pre-Civil War architecture for an exhibition at Wesleyan University where Hitchcock taught. And Gilbert Seldes, an early defender of American popular culture, published This is New York, a guidebook claiming to be the first modern photographic book of New York. The book featured 1 or 2 photographs by Ralph Steiner, Margaret Bourke White, Walker Evans, and others, but included 14 photographs by Abbott. She prepared 2 solo exhibitions that year at the New School, and most important, at the Museum of the City of New York, which was founded in 1929, and in 1932 opened a new building. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a page from it. That's her Flatiron picture on the left. It's a Margaret Bourke White picture on the right. And this is the new building of the Museum of the City of New York that opened in 1932, opposite Central Park on Upper Fifth Avenue and 103rd Street. Abbott's museum show was heavily covered in the New York press, but one out-of-town review proved much more consequential for Abbott's future. Elizabeth McCausland, an art critic for the Spring Republican, which was a liberal Massachusetts newspaper, sent her review to Abbott, which Abbott called the most intelligent criticism of her work in America thus far. The 2 women exchanged letters and then met and soon became companions, each keeping an apartment at 50 Commerce Street. McCausland was a passionate proponent of documentary photography and modern art. Hers was a major voice in the art community of the 1930s. And these are pictures from about 1935, Abbott on the left and McCausland on the right. Abbott's relationship with the Museum of the City of New York had begun in 1931 when she met Harding Shalley, the newly appointed director. Shalley understood Abbott's ambitions and felt that her project belonged at the museum, but jump-starting a museum in the depths of the Depression did not allow him to fund Abbott's project directly. Instead, in 1933, he devised a fundraising campaign for her. With his letter of support and one from the architect Philip Johnson, who had just mounted the controversial international-style exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, Shalley gave Abbott the names of 100 prominent New Yorkers, a who's who of Wall Street, to ask for money. She sought 75 patrons to contribute $250 each for a total of $15,000. This painstaking task, which required her to paste a piece of stationery, carbon paper, and onion skin paper in the typewriter, and to complete 100 error-free letters, yielded a grand total of $50. Abbott kept all the rejection letters. Her consolation prize, which was of considerable professional and personal importance, was the 1934 exhibition, New York by Berenice Abbott, which led to her meeting McCausland, among other things. And this is an exhibition poster that, when I was on staff there, I found in the education department. It's a piece of mat board with the title of the show written in India ink and a vintage print. It's Abbott's photograph of the Puck Building mounted on it. It's large, and it was set up on an easel to direct you to the show within the museum. Abbott succeeded in finding support for her project in 1935 with the creation of the Federal Art Project, which I'm going to refer to as FAP, a program that the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, sort of alphabet soup of government projects from the New Deal, created to provide work relief for artists. Her friendship with the FAP leadership undoubtedly helped, for she was the only photographer in the country to get government funding for her own project. Holger Cahill, a curator at MoMA, was named national head of the FAP, and Audrey McMahon, the president of the College Art Association, became head of the FAP's New York office. Both Cahill and McMahon knew Abbott's track record and were confident that she would use government funds productively. The official goal of the FAP was to provide artists with jobs. It was a dole, it was a relief program. But the FAP leadership also wanted to show the nation that art benefited the public at large. As a result, all FAP projects for murals, sculpture, and easel paintings required institutional sponsors. Scholle, who was on the advisory committee of the New York office of the FAP and who virtually ran the Museum of the City of New York on the FAP payroll, was happy to enlist the museum as Abbott's sponsor. In return, the museum was obliged to purchase for the cost of materials only the end product of Abbott's project. In 1940, it purchased a set of 305 Changing New York exhibition prints for $106.75. In today's art markets, these prints sell from $5,000 to $10,000 each. When Abbott was named an FAP supervisor, she called it the happiest day of my life. With a monthly salary of $145, she could finally photograph New York full-time with help of a secretary, a field assistant, and a darkroom assistant. Now, the field assistant, I should explain, basically helped her carry all that equipment and also helped her keep clear her composition, because if you take this big camera and you put it on the sidewalks in New York, people are going to gawk and ask questions, and so her assistant would help with that too. In the first 3 months, she made 65 images, 40 of which she retained in the final edit of the project. This burst of productivity suggests that she was following through on ideas long planned. After a year, she was given a car, another stimulus to new work, especially in the outer boroughs. Government patronage, however, brought with it its own problems. Like all FAP artists, Abbott competed with other programs for scarce resources, and she struggled against burdensome WPA regulations that had been devised for office workers, but that created unanticipated difficulty for artists who worked odd hours in studios that were usually their homes. For example, they had to come to the FAP office to sign in and sign out. Well, if you don't work there, that's a real problem and a huge waste of time. But these were the kind of obstacles that FAP artists faced. Her biggest headache, however, was her researchers. Almost as an afterthought, Abbott had asked for one clerical assistant, possibly two, to do what she called collateral research. Seizing the opportunity to create more jobs, the FAP assigned her 5 part-time researchers with whom she never established a rapport or a workable routine. In principle, she believed that historic documentation would enhance the value of her work. And in principle, she embraced the cooperative ideals of the FAP. But in practice, she had neither the skills nor the patience to supervise researchers, and she was resentful of the time that they required. Even if Abbott had given her researchers instructions, which she did not, her constant editing of the project presented formidable obstacles. When she took a photograph she was satisfied with, she gave the researchers proof prints, which were assigned consecutive numbers and files. At any point, even after a research file was completed, Abbott might discard an image, its file then marked with a red D for discard. Her reasons remain unknown, and many of the discards would, by my standards, make welcome additions to the project. For example, this is a picture of the interior of Penn Station, built by McKim, Mead, and White, at the turn of the century, famously torn down in the 1960s. So this is one of the pictures that has a D, a discard by it. Here's another one, which is Hooverville, a series of shacks built by homeless people that Houston Street and 2nd Street in New York, also marked with a D and discarded. Not surprisingly, the numbering system and research assignments became confused, and the researchers quickly learned that one step forward produced 2 steps backwards. With little accomplished after a year, the researchers were placed under the supervision of another FAP program, the Index of American Design, which had clearly defined research method. Despite Abbott's protests, a system evolved and progress was made. So I'm just going to show you an example of one of these files. This is a picture called Cheese Store. It's on Bleecker Street in the Village. The store's still there. Not a cheese store at the moment, but the storefront is still there. And this is the worksheet. I don't know if you can see it too carefully, but you can see it was a mimeographed form that the researchers had to fill out that asked for basic documentation about the building. It usually required the researchers to go to the municipal archives and look up the history of the building, when it was built, when additions were filed with the city, and that sort of thing. And then in addition, various researchers invented their own strategies. For example, this wonderful woman who I became very familiar with, named Sally Sands, used to do things like throw a clipping in the file. This is like an article that was in the New York Times Magazine about the modern cheese industry in the 30s. So she just threw that in the file because it was relevant as a contrast, basically a change in our industry between the artisanal cheeses that were made and sold on Bleecker Street and the new cheese industry. And then she also went and interviewed the shop owners, and in this particular case, this typescript on the left is her actually describing each cheese in the windows and which ones were imported and which ones were made in place. So I became a great friend of Sally Sands. I'll just show you the picture again. She actually went and inventoried all those cheeses. And then another kind of interesting approach was a man named Everett Gradama. So here's a picture that Abbott took not of one building but of four. There's four pictures. This is at Broadway and Exchange Place, which is a tiny little alleyway off of Broadway and Wall Street. So what he did was he drew for the elevation. He actually traced the picture, the picture, and then numbered the buildings 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then he has a whole list of information about those buildings 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a separate on separate sheets of paper. And then at the bottom, what he's done is outlined a ground plan, a map essentially, a plot map. From 1934 plot map, used by realtors for the city, and he's actually shown her where she was standing and what her angle was. The research files clearly represent a net gain for the project. Nothing comparable exists for Abbott's pre-FAP New York photographs. Her prints are dispersed, and the several hundred New York negatives that she kept she never identified or dated. She could well have benefited from Atget's example here. Like any good commercial photographer, he labeled his prints and negatives and created a workable retrieval system. By 1937, when Abbott's project, like the entire FAP, was in full swing, the program came under strenuous attack from conservatives in Congress, who balked at government spending in general and government spending for the arts in particular. Artists whose unconventional behavior in leftist politics aroused suspicions proved an easy target for politicians who wished to discredit the whole New Deal. President Roosevelt, who supported the FAP, was preoccupied with his unpopular attempt to pack the Supreme Court and could ill afford to waste political capital on artists. The head of the program, Holger Cahill, launched his own counteroffensive. He organized a massive exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art to mark the FAP's first anniversary, and he opened the Federal Art Gallery on 57th Street to regularly showcase FAP work, and he planned a book of artist statements about the positive effects of the program. Abbott was the only photographer featured in each of Cahill's initiatives. She was a star of the program, and her patron's adversity worked to her advantage. As part of the FAP's defensive campaign, Audrey McMahon asked the Museum of the City of New York to hold a second exhibition of Abbott's work, which took place in the fall of 1937. The exhibition, called Changing New York, was limited to photographs taken during Abbott's tenure with the Federal Art Project only. And this is an installation photograph. It's just very interesting for those of us who are interested in installation. First of all, that there's that huge enlargement, which was even possible. It's technically possible at the time. And also you can see how there's just, the pictures are just set on mounts between picture rails along the wall. And also on the back wall, you can see that several pictures are mounted on one sheet in a very dynamic kind of arrangement. A critical and popular success, the show was marred by one disappointment. The museum had hoped that the researchers would provide descriptive captions for the photographs and had planned to highlight their work in a special showcase, but the researchers failed to reach their deadline and missed the opportunity for public acknowledgement. Abbott's rising reputation and the popular success of her exhibition, which received wide press coverage and was extended by several months, led the commercial publisher E.P. Dutton to propose a book of Changing New York photographs. To Abbott's delight, Elizabeth McCausland was hired by the Federal Writers Project, another WPA program, to write the text. In 1935, Abbott and McCausland had planned to collaborate on a photographic book about America, and McCausland was a passionate advocate for government sponsorship of the arts. The Changing New York book was to be an opportunity to put her ideas into action. Unfortunately, the dream became a nightmare. McCausland had designed a mock-up for the book, and this is a page from it, complete with typefaces which combined a thematic but open-ended text with questions, assorted facts, and quotations, and a free graphic design with full-page bleeds and varied print sizes. The last page, which you can see here on the right side of the screen, contains 7 small photographs of New York's bridges arranged along the left edge of the page like a strip of 35mm film. Dutton rejected McCausland's flexible design for a conservative layout in which 100 full-page photographs would carry traditional captions. Like a conventional guidebook, which Dutton hoped to market to tourists visiting the 1939 New York World's Fair, the approved design presented the photographs in geographical order, from the southern tip of Manhattan to the north and then east to the outer boroughs. Abbott protested in vain, sending Dutton a list of New York guides and reiterating that, quote, "I never had in mind a book of this type." To Abbott's and McCausland's dismay, the design was so mindlessly inflexible that horizontal photographs were laid out as verticals. The only concession won by Abbott was the use in the final book of her jazzy dust jacket design, which placed the title in receding perspective on a detail of a brick wall. I think you can see in the photograph on the right, but on the left side of that picture, there is a brick wall of an exposed brick wall from a tenement, and that is used as a detail of that forms the background for the dust jacket. And a copy of the book, by the way, is in the exhibition upstairs with the dust jacket. The dust jacket, as they always are, is very rare, and it's on view upstairs. Ironically, the detail of the wall was taken from one of Abbott's photographs called Construction Old and New, which was one of 3 photographs eliminated from the book by the editors at the last minute. The book contains 97 rather than its planned 100 photographs. The battle lost, McCausland spent a year working with Abbott's researchers preparing the text, which was summarily rejected. The short declarative captions of the final book, which match Abbott's photographs in their matter-of-fact, no-nonsense tone, bear little relation to McCausland's original draft. Despite these and other disappointments, the book garnered many favorable reviews, and Abbott received many congratulatory letters from admirers as diverse as New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia and California photographer Edward Weston. In 1939, the budget cuts, which the conservative Congress had enacted 2 years previously, threatened the very existence of the Federal Art Project. In public, Abbott accepted praise for her book, while in private, she fought in vain to save her job. Her requests to extend the project were rejected, and she was demoted twice before she was finally laid off in September. It is no wonder that Abbott made no new photographs in the final year of the project. In addition to completing the Dutton book, she produced 2 definitive sets of exhibition prints, one for the Museum of the City of New York and one for the Index of American Design. That was the project that oversaw her researchers. These sets of 305 mounted prints define the project, and both sets ended up in the Museum of the City of New York. When she finished, Abbott was horrified to learn that she would lose control of her negatives. She asked McMahon if any machinery exists whereby I could be consulted when prints or enlargements are made. And in 1940, she wrote Cahill that changing New York photographs not printed by me are being circulated under my name. Although the FAP's top administrators understood Abbott's concern, they could not offer her another job, and they put the public service goals of their program above her artistic scruples. Despite her protestations, the FAP continued to issue prints until 1943, when it was disbanded, and it sent Abbott 700 negatives to the Museum of the City of New York, where they remain. It is impossible to determine how many prints were made, but the New York Public Library owns 2,500 of them, and not including its mounted prints, the Museum of the City of New York has more than 1,000. The last months of the project had to be heartbreaking for Abbott, and although part of her wanted to photograph New York indefinitely, another part was ready to stop. When asked in later years why she turned her attention elsewhere, she remarked that working for the FAP knocked it out of me. After changing New York, Abbott chose another immense subject, photographing science. In 1960, after 20 years of experimentation, her efforts culminated in a series of physics textbooks published by MIT. Her ambitions for Atget came to fruition in the 1960s when Abbott herself was in her 60s. In 1964, Horizon Press published her book, The World of Atget, and in 1968, the Museum of Modern Art agreed to purchase the Atget archive. Abbott had approached MoMA previously without success. From 1947 to 1963, the director of photography there was Edward Steichen, a giant of the field whom Abbott came to despise. Steichen had been a dominant force in American photography since the turn of the century as a pictorial photographer in the 1900s, a magazine photographer in the 1920s and 30s, and as director of Navy photography in the Pacific during World War II. In the 1930s, he hailed the documentary photography practiced by artists like Abbott, but in the 1950s, he was the leading proponent of photojournalism, as seen in picture magazines like Life. Atget left him cold. With Steichen's successor, however, Abbott found her man. At the time, John Zerkowski was nurturing a group of young artists who, with his help, were redefining documentary photography, loosening it from its moorings in photojournalism, the dominant photographic form then. And this is an example of Gary Winograd photograph from the New York World's Fair of 1964, much looser and less narrative and tilted than the photojournalistic standards would allow. And this is a photograph by Lee Friedlander, made in 1963, just a scene of New York, again, just showing, lacking the sort of narrative clarity and of what one would encounter in a picture magazine. Zerkowski did many shows supporting this work, but 1967 he did a show called New Documents, and it featured Winograd, Friedlander, and D.N. Arbus, the portraits of D.N. Arbus. Just as Abbott saw in Atget an iconoclastic purity of spirit that deflated the ironic posturings of the surrealists, so Zerkowski saw in Atget a declarative poetry that challenged what he considered the shallow moral certitudes of photojournalism. MoMA's acquisition of Atget's archive was completely unprecedented. Standard art museum practice was and is to acquire a handful of prints representing the very best work by a photographer, to purchase thousands of prints of varying quality and condition, and more than 1,000 negatives, which are normally not collected by art museums at all, dramatically demonstrated Zerkowski's belief in Atget's unique significance. What brought his behind-the-scenes commitment fully to light, however, was equally unprecedented. Not one, but 4 exhibitions devoted to the work of Atget in the mid-1980s, each accompanied by a catalog which created a 4-volume set. This expensive project required years of work by a small army of curatorial assistants and scholars, most notably Maria Morris Homburg, who had recently completed her PhD dissertation on Atget for the Art History Department at Columbia University. While newspapers raved and crowds came, academic critics recoiled. Atget is not an artist, they cried. He is just a journeyman photographer. The collection belongs in a library, not a museum of modern art. The real target of these attacks, however, was not Atget, but Zerkowski. From its beginnings in the 1930s, MoMA, alone among American art museums, collected and exhibited photography. In 60 years, there were only 3 curators: the photographic historian Beaumont Newhall, Edward Steichen, and John Zerkowski, each of whom was the dominant tastemaker of his day. When Zerkowski acquired the Atget collection from MoMA in 1968, he was in his prime. A brilliant pedagogue, Zerkowski articulated an aesthetic approach to photography when the market in art photography was just developing. Each of his exhibitions was eagerly anticipated and extensively reviewed. By the time of the Atget extravaganza in the 1980s, however, Zerkowski's influence was waning. I'm sorry. And his taste was starting to seem dated. Show after show of small black and white prints that earnestly lauded the sensibility of an individual photographer had little appeal for a younger generation interested in popular culture and performance art, and just as sort of, space markers of that, I'm showing you Cindy Sherman's film still from 1978. These are all self-portraits in which Sherman is taking on the guise of grade B movie characters, and Richard Prince's Untitled work from 1980, in which he has appropriated a photograph from a Marlboro ad and blown it up into a large piece, a color piece for museum exhibition. Atget idolatry represented not creative inspiration as it did for Abbott or for Winograd, but as art historian Abigail Solomon Godot noted, it's a perfectly dead thing. For what it's worth, here's my own opinion of the Atget controversy. I think it's important to be very careful labeling as artists 19th century photographers. From the 1840s to the 1890s, almost all photographers were commercial photographers who did not see themselves as artists. There were a few serious amateurs, such as Julia Margaret Cameron, who attempted art with the camera. But for the most part, photographers did not work to express themselves, and they did not define themselves as cultural arbiters. This does not mean that they weren't concerned with composition as well as craft. It does mean, however, that they worked within the cultural system of their day, which placed photography on the margins of fine art. After the 1890s, however, large numbers of amateur photographers did aspire to be artists, and by the turn of the century, those photographers sought to establish careers as professionals. To elevate their status and define their roles, these artists mined photography's short history for inspiration. In the 1920s, Berenice Abbott and Walker Evans revived the reputations of Atget, the French portraitist Nadar, and the American Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. In the 1930s, Ansel Adams brought attention to the photographers of Yosemite, and this is a comparison of a Carlton Watkins picture of the Canyon de Chelly next to an Ansel Adams of the same site. And in the 1940s, the social reformer Jacob Riis was rediscovered. In their search for role models, photographers recast the past of their own image, exercising what I would call creative misreading. In the 1960s and 70s, however, as more museums began to collect and hire curators, the process of canonization of 19th century practitioners accelerated. Zerkowski played a major role in this process, creating the aesthetic underpinnings of the endless expansion of the photographic canon. He claimed that all photographers of artistic significance, regardless of the context in which they worked, shared the photographer's eye, by which he meant that they intuitively explored the expressive possibilities of the camera's subjective viewpoint. The tools of modernist composition, such as framing, cropping, and close-up, became the tools of any photographer, regardless of time or place. And of all photographers, the most important eye was Atget's. Personally, I'm a great admirer of Zerkowski, whose seductive writing has encouraged me, among thousands of others, to look more carefully at photographs. But I'm not a true believer. His photographer's eye has wreaked havoc with photographic history, distorting curatorial judgment to this day. As for Atget, it is probably the case that his archive doesn't belong at MoMA, and the 4-part Atget extravaganza, which is really something of an embarrassment, has set a luxury standard which other museums unfortunately strive to emulate. The leading practitioner of what I call the glamour treatment of 19th century photographers is not, by the way, MoMA, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where Marie Morris Homburg, Yochelski's Atget collaborator, formed the Department of Photography in 1996. I approach all of the Met's 19th century photography shows with guarded skepticism. Nevertheless, I'm grateful that Abbott and Zurkowsky believed what they believed about Atget, because otherwise his archive might not have survived and his photographs would certainly have been unknown to us. Like Zurkowsky, I am deeply moved by Atget's late work, which does seem to break free from the constraints set by his clientele. And to that extent, I accept that Atget was more than a journeyman photographer. And to the extent that Atget proved inspirational to Abbott, I'm also grateful. Without his example, she might not have left Paris to create Changing New York, a project that has not only provided me with several years' work, but continues to enrich my daily experience of the city. I still take note when I pass the site of an Abbott photograph, or when the strong afternoon light casts harsh geometric shadows as it does in her best photographs, or when I notice a particularly striking juxtaposition of old and new buildings. I have Atget to thank for that. Thank you. A little late. Yes.
My name is James Mitchell. How did Berenice Abbott become a great photographer of all after he became a failure as an actor?
Oh, Atget. I don't know. There's so little known biographically about him. We just don't know, but we know that he was over 30 when he first started taking photographs. There's so scant evidence about, that's why this whole myth about him could grow up, because we know so little, there's so little factual basis for our understanding of him.
And finally, I also have one more question. How did Abbott been demoted before being laid off as a photographer?
She was, okay, the problem with Abbott, when the budget cuts came in, because the FAP was a relief program to give people jobs who didn't have jobs, her job was in peril because she was teaching at the New School for Social Research. So because she already had a job, the government had to say, well, if you already have a job, then you don't need this job. As far as the demotion was concerned, they took away her being a supervisor and started giving her assignments where she had to photograph what she was asked to photograph instead of to continue her own work. And then finally they laid her off, and then she lost control of the negatives, as I explained. Yes?
Can I get you to explore a little bit more the things that you were just saying about Atget in particular, but Zurkowsky and sort of, the legacy of Atget that he framed. So you regard Atget, but you feel as though his 4-volume project and then how that's continued at the Met is too strongly hyped and doesn't have as enough a kind of cultural analysis that you'd like to see with it?
Well, first of all, it's a physical thing. I mean, if you go to a Met show, it's just the Met being the Met. But, they'll have 8-ply mats, these really luxurious mats, and gorgeous, individualized frames. And these are pictures. So already, just from the physical presence of these 19th century pictures, they're sending off like signals that these are master works. So that's, that already sets. It is, but it also sets a certain standard that others, people will go to those shows and say, oh my God, this is gorgeous, we have to try to do this if we can afford it. So it sets up a certain expectation, a curatorial expectation. But then more important, and then the other thing that the Met does, well, it's not just the Met, it's just the Met did so many series of shows throughout the 90s of this type that I think they no longer don't necessarily have that kind of influence, but they set such a standard at the time. there was just a seriousness about the picture, about the shows. There was no sense of the sort of marginal status of an artist, which sometimes there's, and the text of their copy is always assuming this kind of photographer's eye, which we really don't know existed. So for example, in the Nadar show that they had there, it's this, as I say, this glamour treatment. Nadar was, an entrepreneur and sort of a scam artist, which is kind of his charm, from our perspective. And there was none of the kind of, he was a showman. And so I was so disappointed to see that show because it was so self-serious and it's so ponderous, and it's like all the pictures are treated equally and all the pictures are treated with what I would call too much respect for, to the point that it kind of sucks all the life out of them. So that's the kind of thing I mean. Equally, Degas, who was not a serious photographer at all and took like 40 photographs. They're fascinating. He's one of the great artists of the 19th century, of course, and his use of photography is fascinating as well because it was such an integral part of his vision, especially his vision in his later days when he was going blind. So it's very interesting. But again, there are 40 pictures. They produced a catalogue raisonné. A catalog in which each of those 40 pictures is treated as if it were a masterwork, when what they really were was just kind of part of his working method. So again, it's not that it's, that they shouldn't do a Degas show and that that's not important, but it's just this, they bring to every one of these projects the same point of view, which is that here was a great artist at work. And by doing that, there is what I feel is that one of the great things about the photography in the 19th century is that because there was not an expectation as to who a photographer was and how they would work, there's such a variety. There's such an opportunity to treat the medium in your own way and have it do what you need it to do. It was really experimental. And that by treating everything the same and assuming that there's this photographer's eye and that the person's intentionally making great works of art kind of, does a disservice to those photographers. Does that make sense? You may disagree, I don't know.
Yes, it does. I can talk to you about it all.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And as I say, I think this has all been rather eclipsed by, first of all, now, the digital world has completely blown that whole model out the window, at least as far as working photographers are concerned. I teach graduate students at the School of Visual Arts and Photography, and they actually have a hard time even relating to the whole tradition of photography, of contemporary, of this, what they call, this blew my mind, classic photography. For me, it's photography. For them, it's like classic, as if it's been somehow, put in under glass. Yes. And yet at the same time, the art market has gone, as many of you know, has gone insane. And so on the one hand, you have this kind of promiscuous thing of the internet, and photos being everywhere and doing everything, which creates a whole set of interesting possibilities for young art photographers. And at the same time, this inflated art market with these giant prints for $100,000. Somebody like Abbott who couldn't sell a picture for $50. So it's this strange bifurcation that's happened. But in terms of the 19th century, the way it's being seen, it is seen by museums, seems to me to often it's a big mistake to see the 19th century photographers through the lens of 20th century aesthetics.